The steady hum of my truck's engine was a sound I could have sworn ran through my veins at this point. After 15 years on the road, you get to know every creak, rattle, and vibration of your rig like it's a part of you. My Peterbilt wasn't just a truck. It was my home away from home, my fortress on wheels. I had just pulled into the lot at Bear's truck stop, a weathered spot off I-70, and was sipping a scalding cup of black coffee. My phone buzzed on the dash. The name Carl Dispatch lit up the screen. I answered, already dreading whatever last-minute job he was about to drop in my lap. "Jack, you're my best guy," Carl said, his voice syrupy with flattery, the kind that always preceded a hassle. "Got a hot one for you. Urgent haul from Indiana to Kansas City. Need it there by tomorrow night. Can you swing it?" I sighed, rubbing the bridge of my nose. "What's the load?" "High-priority medical equipment. The good money kind," Carl added, throwing in the bait. I took a moment to glance at the truck stop. A handful of other drivers were milling about, most of them groggy-eyed and dragging their feet. It wasn't like I had anything better to do, and the pay sounded promising. "Fine," I said. "Send over the details." Carl didn't even try to hide his relief. "You're a lifesaver, Jack. Route's straightforward. Take 70 most of the way, switch to 35, and you're golden." He hung up, and I punched the coordinates into my GPS. Sure enough, the route looked as easy as Carl had promised. A few stretches of highway, minimal city driving, and a clear weather forecast. I finished my coffee, grabbed a couple of energy drinks from the store, and hit the road. The first leg of the trip was uneventful. The miles clicked by as the rhythmic roar of the engine drowned out my thoughts. I had classic rock blaring from the speakers, the kind of tunes that made long-haul drives almost enjoyable. Springsteen's gravelly voice crooned as the Indiana farmland blurred into Missouri's endless stretch of flat nothingness. Everything was going smoothly until I hit a glowing orange sign just past Columbia. Road closed. Detour ahead. I muttered a curse under my breath and slowed to a stop. Up ahead, a line of sawhorses blocked the road completely, their reflective strips glowing ominously in the dusk. I rolled down the window and craned my neck to look for a detour sign. But the only thing waiting beyond the blockade was a cloud of dust kicked up by the dying evening breeze. The GPS chimed in its usual monotone, recalculating with a lag that made my patience wear thin. "Come on," I growled, watching the spinning loading icon. Finally, it spat out a new route. "Take exit 82 in 5 miles and proceed north," the voice instructed. I followed the directions, but as soon as I turned off, the GPS stuttered, freezing entirely before going blank. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, pulling over onto the shoulder. I fumbled with the device, tapping its screen, but it was as dead as a flat tire. Frustrated, I reached for my phone, hoping to check the Maps app, only to see that I'd lost signal too. No bars, just a mocking little no service in the corner of the screen. I leaned back in my seat, exhaling sharply. The sun was setting fast, painting the horizon with streaks of crimson and violet. The road ahead was empty, desolate even, the kind of loneliness that made you feel like you'd driven straight off the edge of the world. With no other option, I dug around in the glove compartment. Beneath old insurance papers, a flashlight, and a few stray granola bars, my fingers found the edge of a creased paper map. I unfolded it, the crisp sound of paper filling the cab. It was one of those cheap gas station maps, a relic of a bygone era. My eyes scanned the tiny print until I spotted my location. There, etched faintly near the bottom, was a faint line labeled Old Route 60. It wasn't the main highway, that much was clear, but it seemed to snake roughly in the same direction I needed to go. "Better than sitting here all night," I muttered, stuffing the map into the passenger seat and putting the truck in gear. As I turned onto Old Route 60, the pavement immediately felt rougher, the tires bumping over cracks and potholes. The road was narrow, flanked by dense trees that seemed to lean in, their gnarled branches casting shadows that danced under my headlights. The radio began to crackle, the once clear strains of Led Zeppelin now garbled and faint. I fiddled with the dial, but every station was static. My irritation gave way to unease as I glanced at the GPS again. It was still frozen, stuck on the same error screen. The further I drove, the darker it seemed to get, the road stretching endlessly ahead with no signs of life. No other vehicles. No estetlights. Just the occasional, disconcerting rustle of branches in the wind. I told myself it was just an old, forgotten road, nothing to worry about. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that I might have made a mistake. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles widening as the road swallowed me whole. I hadn't planned to take this road, and the further I went, the clearer it became why. It wasn't just rough, it felt abandoned. The faded lines that marked the center were nearly invisible, and weeds crept onto the crumbling asphalt like veins reclaiming a corpse. Overhead, the thick canopy of trees knitted together, shutting out what little light remained of the day. I checked the map again, though I'd practically memorized the faint route at this point. The Bygone Route was its name, scrawled in fading ink near the bottom edge of the paper. It wasn't marked as closed, but everything about it screamed no entry. Still, it seemed to lead toward my destination, and with the GPS and phone useless, I didn't have many options. The silence in the cab was unbearable, so I reached for the radio. I'd been in enough dead zones to know I probably wouldn't get much, but I was willing to settle for some static if it meant breaking the quiet. I twisted the dial. At first, there was nothing but the low hiss of white noise. I kept turning, hoping to catch even a faint signal. Then, through the static, I thought I heard something. "Jack!" I froze, my hand still gripping the knob. The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the interference, but it was there. "Jack? Are you listening?" The blood drained from my face. My name. It had said my name. I quickly turned the dial again, frantically scanning for a new station. Static, static, more static. No music, no news, no advertisements, just that endless, droning hiss. I was about to give up when another voice broke through, sharp and guttural, like gravel in a blender. "You shouldn't be here." I yanked my hand back from the dial, as if the radio had burned me. "Just interference," I muttered, my voice shaky. "Probably CB chatter from some other trucker. Happens all the time." Except I didn't believe that. The cab didn't have a CB radio, and even if it did, who out here would know my name? The road stretched on, darker and more deserted with every mile. The trees pressed in closer, their twisted branches clawing at the edges of my headlights. My high beams barely pierced the gloom, revealing only the crumbled pavement and the occasional roadside marker. Rusted signs, so faded they were unreadable. The truck jolted as I hit a deep pothole, rattling everything in the cab. My thermos toppled over, spilling cold coffee onto the floor. I cursed and leaned over to grab it, but as I straightened up, my stomach lurched. There was something on the road. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, the shape didn't make sense. It was hunched and gaunt, its limbs too long and spindly for any animal I'd ever seen. The headlights illuminated its pale, rubbery skin, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its head snapped toward me, two pinpricks of glowing red light where its eyes should have been. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. The creature darted off the road and vanished into the trees, faster than anything that size should have been able to move. My heart hammered in my chest. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, as if saying it out loud might make it less real. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The cab felt stifling, the air too thick to breathe. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe an owl or a coyote. But deep down I knew better. Eventually, I forced myself to keep driving. The engine rumbled back to life, and the truck rolled forward, but my nerves were shot. Every shadow that flickered at the edge of my headlights made me jump, and the static on the radio seemed louder now, almost mocking. The road grew narrower, the trees closing in like a tunnel. The pavement turned to gravel, then to dirt, but the map showed no other options. And then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through the trees. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded like voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, murmuring just at the edge of hearing. "Turn around," they seemed to say. "Leave. Not welcome." I cranked the volume on the radio, desperate to drown them out. but the static only grew louder, layered with faint, distorted laughter. It was high-pitched and childlike, but wrong, like nails scraping against glass. "Enough," I snapped, slamming my hand on the dash. The laughter stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, just as I began to hope it was over, the radio crackled back to life. "Keep going, Jack," the voice said, low and malevolent. "We're waiting for you." My foot hit the gas pedal almost reflexively, and the truck surged forward. The Bygone Route twisted and turned, its curves growing sharper and more unpredictable. I felt like I was being funneled somewhere, herded like cattle into a trap. But no matter how far I drove, the road never ended. The truck's headlights caught another shape darting across the road. This one even taller and more distorted than the last. It lingered just long enough for me to see the gaping, toothy grin stretched across its face before disappearing into the shadows. Sweat dripped down my forehead, my hands slick against the wheel. My only thought was to get out, to find some sign of civilization. But the deeper I went, the more I realized there was no turning back. The Bygone Route had me now, and it wasn't letting go. The mist rolled in like a tide, swallowing the world outside my windshield. One moment, I could see the vague outline of trees flanking the road. The next, they disappeared into a wall of white. The headlights barely cut through it, casting faint beams that seemed to dissolve into the dense fog. "Keep it together, Jack," I muttered to myself, gripping the wheel tighter. The Bygone Route was playing tricks on me, sure, but it was just a bad road in bad weather. Nothing I couldn't handle. But the mist wasn't normal. It had a weight to it, a presence that pressed against the truck like an invisible hand. The air inside the cab grew colder, and my breath fogged up the window. I switched the heater on, but it did nothing to fight the creeping chill. As I squinted through the fog, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light playing across the haze. But it moved. A figure emerged at the edge of the road, humanoid but wrong. It stood unnaturally still, its elongated body half hidden by the mist. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was a featureless oval, smooth and pale like porcelain. I hit the brakes instinctively, the truck lurching to a stop. The figure didn't move. "Who the hell?" I whispered, reaching for the door handle. But something in my gut screamed not to open it. I honked the horn, a sharp blast that shattered the silence. The figure tilted its head slightly, like a curious animal, then melted back into the mist without a sound. My heart pounded as I stared at the spot where it had been, half expecting it to reappear. When it didn't, I pressed on the gas, eager to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. The mist thickened the further I drove, wrapping around the truck like a living thing. The radio continued its static-filled symphony, broken occasionally by faint whispers and crackles that set my nerves on edge. Then came the bang. It was loud and sudden, like something heavy slamming against the side of the truck. The whole cab shook with the impact, and I swerved instinctively, barely managing to keep the rig on the road. "What the?" I slammed the brakes and twisted in my seat, scanning the mirrors for whatever had hit me. At first, there was nothing, just swirling fog and the faint outlines of the trees. Then I saw it, a bloody handprint smeared across the passenger window. I froze, my mind racing. The handprint was too high to belong to someone standing on the ground. Whoever, or whatever, had left it had to be perched on the truck itself. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I reached over and locked the doors. My hands shook as I double-checked the windows, making sure they were rolled up tight. Something scraped against the roof of the cab, a long, slow sound like nails dragging across metal. I grabbed the tire iron from under the seat, clutching it like a lifeline. The scraping stopped, replaced by a rhythmic tapping, deliberate and taunting. Whatever was up there wanted me to know it was there. I had two options: sit here and wait for it to make its move, or hit the gas and hope it lost its grip. I chose the latter. Slamming the truck into gear, I floored it. The engine roared as the tires skidded briefly before catching traction. The tapping stopped as the truck surged forward, and for a brief, blissful moment, I thought I'd shaken it. Then a face appeared at the corner of the windshield. It wasn't human. Its skin was mottled gray, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Its eyes were hollow pits that seemed to suck in the light, and its mouth, too wide, too full of teeth, curled into a grotesque smile. I screamed, slamming the windshield wipers on reflexively. The blades swept across its face, smearing blood and mist, but the creature didn't move. It just stared at me, unblinking, as if it were savoring my fear. With a sudden burst of speed, it scuttled sideways like a spider, disappearing from view. The truck rocked violently as something landed on the roof. The sound of pounding footsteps echoed above me, heading toward the back. Not today, I growled, adrenaline drowning out my terror. I yanked the wheel hard to the left, sending the truck swerving across the narrow road. The rear wheels hit a patch of gravel, and the entire rig tilted dangerously before slamming back onto the pavement. The pounding stopped. Whatever was up there was gone, or at least I hoped it was. The road stretched endlessly ahead. No signs, no landmarks, no other vehicles. The map had promised only a few miles, but I felt like I'd been driving for hours. The fog began to play tricks on my eyes. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, humanoid shapes that dissolved whenever I turned to look. A figure darted across the road in front of me, too fast for me to stop, but when I braced for impact, there was nothing. My knuckles ached from gripping the wheel so tightly, but I couldn't let go. The road seemed alive now, shifting and warping beneath the truck's tires. Then I saw it, a faint light in the distance, glowing through the mist like a beacon. Relief flooded me. A gas station, maybe, or a house. Anything was better than this cursed stretch of road. I pressed on the gas, the truck hurtling toward the light. But as I got closer, my relief turned to dread. The light wasn't a gas station. It wasn't a house. It was another truck, identical to mine, with its headlights pointed straight at me. My truck. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been here before. I was driving in a circle. The mist closed in tighter, and the whispers grew louder, their words incomprehensible but dripping with malice. I slammed my hands against the wheel, screaming into the void. I wasn't just lost. I was trapped. I clenched the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, staring at the taillights of my own truck up ahead. It didn't make sense. I hadn't turned around, hadn't doubled back. I should have been moving forward, away from whatever nightmare this was. Slowing to a crawl, I edged closer, half expecting the other truck to vanish into the mist like everything else I'd seen on this cursed road. Instead, it stayed put, unmoving, as though mocking my disbelief. The truck wasn't just similar, it was identical. Same weathered blue paint, same dent on the rear bumper from a close shave in a Denver parking lot. My license plate stared back at me like an accusation. 3RT57N. My stomach churned. I couldn't just sit there, but I couldn't bring myself to keep driving either. If this road was playing tricks on me, maybe retracing my steps would break the loop. I yanked the wheel, making a sharp U-turn, and floored the gas. The mist seemed to thicken in protest, swallowing the road even faster as I retraced my path. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The road stretched on endlessly, its cracks and jagged edges a cruel monotony. I recognized the occasional marker, a bent street sign, a broken guardrail, but they didn't reassure me. They only proved I was driving in circles. Fuel was becoming a concern. I glanced at the gauge, my heart sinking as the needle hovered just above the red. I couldn't afford to keep aimlessly looping. I needed a plan. Spotting a widening of the road ahead, I pulled over. The mist pressed close, swirling around the truck like a living thing. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt deafening, broken only by my own ragged breathing. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out onto the cracked pavement. The cold mist clung to my skin, soaking through my jacket almost instantly. The truck loomed in the weak beam of light, its edges blurred by the fog. I made my way around to the fuel tank, muttering curses under my breath as I unscrewed the cap. Tilting the flashlight, I checked the levels. Low, too low for comfort. At this rate, I'd be stranded in a matter of hours. That's when I saw them. Claw marks. 4 deep gouges ran the length of the driver's side door, slicing clean through the paint and into the metal beneath. The edges were jagged, as though whatever had made them had used brute force rather than precision. My heart pounded as I ran my fingers over the grooves. They hadn't been there earlier. Of that much, I was certain. A faint sound caught my attention, dragging my gaze toward the truck bed. It was a scratching noise, soft but insistent, like nails raking against wood. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The scratching stopped. Gripping the flashlight tighter, I moved toward the back of the truck, each step feeling heavier than the last. The beam of light danced across the tailgate, and for a moment, I hesitated. "Don't be stupid," I muttered to myself. "It's probably just a raccoon or something." Taking a deep breath, I peered over the edge of the bed. It was empty. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The scratching resumed, louder this time, and it wasn't coming from the truck bed. It was coming from underneath. I backed away, my breath hitching. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I crouched to look beneath the truck. Nothing, just shadows and mist. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my nerves. Then the truck rocked. It wasn't much, just a subtle sway, as though something heavy had shifted its weight inside. But it was enough to send me scrambling back into the cab. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving. The scratching stopped again, replaced by a soft thud, like footsteps receding into the fog. I sat there, gripping the tire iron-eyed retrieved from the passenger seat, my eyes scanning the darkness outside. My breath fogged up the windshield, but I couldn't bring myself to wipe it away. I was being hunted. The silence didn't last long. A low growl echoed from somewhere behind me, guttural and menacing. I twisted in my seat, my eyes darting to the mirrors. Nothing, but the growl came again, louder this time, vibrating through the cab. It was followed by a sharp thunk as something hit the rear of the truck. I floored the gas. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching against the asphalt. I didn't care about the fuel anymore. Whatever was out there, I wasn't sticking around to meet it. The mist parted briefly as I sped down the road, revealing the twisted shapes of trees on either side. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, humanoid figures darting between the trunks. I kept driving, my hands trembling on the wheel. The road seemed endless, a nightmare that refused to let me wake. The growls faded into the distance, but the fear didn't leave me. It wasn't until I rounded a sharp bend that I saw it again. The other truck. My truck. It was parked in the middle of the road, its headlights cutting through the mist like twin daggers. This time, the door was open, swinging gently in the wind. I hit the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the identical vehicle. A figure stepped out from the fog. It was tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. Its face was blank, featureless, but I felt its gaze boring into me. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at me. The lights in my truck flickered, the engine sputtering and dying. The radio crackled to life, a cacophony of static and distorted laughter. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I sat in the darkness, gripping the tire iron and staring at the empty road ahead. The mist swirled closer, wrapping around the truck like a suffocating blanket. There was no escaping the Bygone Route. Not now. Not ever. The road ahead was empty except for the fog, an oppressive, smothering void that pressed against the truck like a weight. The headlights did little to cut through it now, creating a shimmering wall of white that seemed to reflect more than reveal. I kept my grip tight on the wheel, my knuckles aching. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was alive, pulsating with a dreadful rhythm, like a predator circling its prey. The faint hum of the truck's engine was the only thing grounding me in reality. That's when I saw him. A figure appeared in the distance, standing dead center in the road. He was motionless, a shadow barely distinguishable from the mist. At first, I thought it was another trick of the fog, a tree, or a reflection. But as I drew closer, it became clear that this was a man. His clothes were simple, a plaid shirt and jeans that looked as though they'd been plucked from a Midwestern thrift shop. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder and stood with one arm raised, palm out, flagging me down. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving. I'd seen too much on this cursed road to trust anything or anyone I encountered here. But the man didn't move, even as my truck approached. "Don't do it, Jack," I whispered to myself. My foot hesitated over the brake pedal. The figure grew clearer, his face coming into view. He looked young, maybe mid-20s, with unkempt hair and an expression that seemed equal parts desperate and resigned. His lips moved as if he was shouting, but no sound reached me. I slowed to a stop, the truck idling a few yards away from him. The man took a cautious step forward, his hands raised as if to show he meant no harm. His mouth moved again, and this time, I heard faint words over the low growl of the engine. "Please, let me in." I rolled the window down an inch, just enough to hear him without letting the night in. "Who are you?" I called out. The man flinched, glancing nervously at the surrounding mist. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in years. "You have to keep moving. They'll come if you stay too long." "Who'll come?" I demanded, leaning slightly out the window. "The ones who feed on the lost," he replied. His eyes were wide, darting toward the trees as if expecting something to lunge out at any moment. Something about him set my nerves on edge. He didn't look threatening, but there was an unnatural stillness to him, like he didn't quite belong. His skin was pale, too pale, and his clothes, though rumpled, showed no sign of wear or dirt, despite the years he claimed to have been trapped. "How long have you been out here?" I asked, my grip tightening on the door handle. "Years. Decades, maybe. It's hard to tell." He swallowed hard, his voice cracking. "You won't age on this road. You just stay." His words sent a chill down my spine. "How do I get off it?" He shook his head, a shadow of hopelessness crossing his face. "You can't. Not unless they let you." I looked past him, into the fog that now seemed to swirl more aggressively, as if alive. "Who are they?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the truck, his movements quick and jittery. "You have to go now. You've stopped too long. They know you're here." "Who knows?" I demanded, my patience fraying. Before he could answer, a noise cut through the fog. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of branches snapping. The man's face contorted with fear. "It's too late," he whispered. "They're coming. Get in." I barked, unlocking the passenger door. He shook his head violently. "They don't want me. They want you. You're fresh meat." Before I could respond, he turned and bolted into the mist. I leaned out the window, calling after him, but he was already gone, swallowed by the fog, as if he'd never been there at all. The growling grew louder, closer, and I didn't wait to see what was making it. Slamming the window shut, I floored the gas, the truck lurching forward. The mist clung to the windshield, making it almost impossible to see, but I didn't care. Something darted across the road ahead, too fast for me to identify. It was followed by another, then another. Shapes, tall, gaunt and inhuman, moved in the fog, flanking the truck on both sides. The road twisted sharply, and I nearly lost control, the tires skidding on the uneven pavement. The mist seemed to close in tighter, and for a brief, terrifying moment I thought I heard voices. Not the whispers from before. These were louder, guttural, and alien, like a language not meant for human ears. The truck rocked violently as something slammed against the side. My hands trembled on the wheel as I fought to keep it steady. "They don't want me. They want you." The hitchhiker's words echoed in my head, and for the first time, I understood what he meant. This road wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a hunting ground, and I was the prey. I glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting to see the man sitting there, but it was empty. Had he been real? Or was he just another illusion, another trick of the mist? The growls faded into the distance as the truck gained speed, but the fear didn't leave me. My eyes darted to the mirrors, half expecting to see one of those gaunt shapes climbing into the bed. But the mirrors reflected nothing, just fog and shadows. I pressed on, the hitchhiker's final words ringing in my ears. "You're fresh meat." The engine's low rumble and the swirls of mist outside began to feel hypnotic, lulling me into a dangerous haze. My eyes burned from hours of staring into the fog. desperately searching for any sign of escape. The fear that had driven me to keep moving was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that crept into my limbs like lead. I checked the fuel gauge again. The needle had dipped precariously close to empty. The inevitable was coming, whether I wanted to face it or not. "I can't keep this up," I muttered, rubbing my face with one hand. My eyes darted to the mirrors, then to the windshield, scanning for movement. Nothing, just the endless mist pressing in on all sides. Reluctantly, I eased the truck to a stop, the hiss of the brakes echoing in the stillness. I locked the doors, double-checking the windows for the third time, then leaned back in the driver's seat. My body screamed for rest, even as my mind screamed against it. "I'll just close my eyes for a second," I lied to myself. Sleep came quickly, dragging me under like a riptide. I was no longer in the cab. I was home, or rather, what had once been home. The smell of my mother's cooking filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of pine from the Christmas tree in the corner. Warmth radiated from the fireplace, and the hum of conversation buzzed around me as family members filled the small living room. The scene was impossibly vivid. My parents laughed, their voices as familiar and comforting as a lullaby. My cousins played on the floor, their giggles echoing like chimes. I could almost taste the sugar cookies piled high on the kitchen counter. But something was wrong. At first, I couldn't place it. Everything seemed so perfect, so idyllic. But as I moved through the room, my chest tightened with an inexplicable sense of unease. Then I saw it, the shadow. It stood in the corner, just beyond the reach of the fireplace's glow. A tall, formless figure, darker than the room's shadows had any right to be. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. I looked around, expecting someone to notice it, to call it out or react in fear. But no one seemed to see it. The laughter continued, oblivious. My mother passed a tray of hors d'oeuvres to my father, who accepted it with a grin. My cousins raced by, nearly bumping into the figure as they chased each other. Yet they didn't flinch or pause. I opened my mouth to say something, to warn them, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, strangled by an invisible hand. The shadow turned its head, or at least it seemed to, its featureless void of a face tilted toward me. And though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze burrowing into me, cold and invasive. "Jack," it whispered, its voice a low rasp that cut through the cheerful hum of the room like a knife. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. My parents turned to me, their faces now blank and pale, their eyes gone. My cousins froze mid-motion, their forms flickering like static on a broken TV screen. The shadow stepped closer. "Jack!" I woke with a start, my heart slamming against my ribs. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My hands clawed at the seatbelt, and it took me several seconds to realize I was still in the truck. The dream clung to me like a heavy fog, my mind struggling to separate it from reality. The cab was quiet, save for the faint tick of the cooling engine. I rubbed my face, trying to shake off the lingering fear. That's when I saw them. Scratches. They ran across the inside of the windshield, jagged and deep, as though something had clawed at the glass from within. My stomach lurched. The dream came rushing back in vivid detail. The shadow, its gaze, its whispered words. "Jack!" I turned instinctively, half expecting to see it in the passenger seat. But the cab was empty. The scratches glistened faintly, catching the dim glow of the dashboard lights. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers trembling as they traced the gouges. The glass felt icy cold, far colder than it should have been. A low noise broke the silence, a faint tapping coming from the roof. My breath caught in my throat. Tap! Tulp! It was deliberate, rhythmic, as though something, or someone, was testing the truck's defenses. Gripping the tire iron I'd left on the seat, I shifted slowly, my eyes darting to the mirrors. Nothing. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. It was coming from above, directly over my head. "Get it together," I whispered to myself, clutching the tire iron like a lifeline. The growling grew louder, vibrating through the cab. I clenched my teeth, every muscle in my body tense as I prepared to bolt. But then, Just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence. It was worse than the growling. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear any sound, any movement. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I opened the door and stepped out. The mist swirled around me, thicker than ever. The truck loomed like a ghostly shape in the fog, its edges blurred and shifting. I looked up, shining the flashlight toward the roof. Nothing, but as I turned back toward the cab, my breath caught. On the hood of the truck, faint but unmistakable, was a handprint. It was large and misshapen, the fingers too long and thin, the palm pressed deep into the dust and grime. My chest tightened as I stared at it, the memory of the shadow's gaze burning in my mind. I didn't sleep again. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died with a final, pitiful groan. No, come on, I muttered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. The truck gave a weak click and then fell silent, the dashboard lights flickering before fading into darkness. I sat there, gripping the wheel with trembling hands, my heart hammering in my chest. The mist seemed to press closer now, seeping into the cab like a living thing. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of cooling metal. The fuel gauge had been near empty for miles, but I'd held on to a shred of hope that I'd make it to, well, somewhere. Now, stranded in the middle of nowhere, that hope crumbled. I reached for the flashlight, fumbling with the switch as I cast the beam out into the fog. It illuminated the twisted branches of trees on either side of the road, their gnarled shapes resembling skeletal hands reaching toward the truck. The mist swirled around them, alive with unseen motion. And then I heard it. Tap! It was faint, a single deliberate sound, like a fingertip against glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head toward the passenger side window. Tap! Tap! This time, it was louder, more insistent. The beam of my flashlight flickered over the window, but there was nothing there. Only my own pale reflection staring back at me. The tapping continued, moving now, traveling around the cab. First the rear window, then the driver's side. Talk, tap, tap. I grabbed the tire iron from the passenger seat, holding it like a lifeline. My knuckles whitened around the cold steel as I scanned the windows, my pulse pounding in my ears. And then the faces appeared. They pressed against the glass, grotesque and distorted, as if smeared by some invisible force. Their eyes were hollow voids, black and endless, and their mouths were stretched into impossibly wide grins filled with jagged teeth. One face turned toward me, tilting its head like a curious animal. Its grin widened further, the corners of its mouth splitting open to reveal raw, glistening flesh. I screamed, swinging the tire iron wildly, though the faces remained untouched by the blows. More appeared, their ghastly visages crowding the windows, their grins growing wider with each passing second. They didn't move, didn't try to force their way inside. They just watched, and then the tapping resumed. This time, it was synchronized, dozens of fingers rapping against the glass in a maddening rhythm. The sound filled the cab, drowning out my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I locked the doors, though I doubted it would do much good, and scrambled into the sleeper cab behind the driver's seat. There, I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the tire iron like a lifeline. The tapping grew louder, faster, echoing in my skull like a drumbeat. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The faces didn't respond, their grins frozen in eerie, silent laughter. And then they started to move. Their heads jerked unnaturally, twisting and snapping as if their necks were made of brittle twigs. One face melted into the fog, only for another to take its place, closer this time. I slammed the tire iron against the cab wall, desperate to drown out the noise. "Get away!" The tapping stopped abruptly. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. I stared at the windows, my breath catching in my throat. The faces were gone. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought it was over. And then the truck shook. It wasn't a subtle movement. It was violent, jarring, as if something massive had slammed against the side. The cab rocked again, the force of the impact throwing me forward. I scrambled back, pressing myself into the corner as the truck groaned under the strain. The roof buckled inward slightly, a dent appearing as something heavy climbed onto the cab. I aimed the flashlight upward, the beam catching the underside of a long, gangly arm stretching across the roof. Its skin was pallid and mottled, veins pulsing beneath the surface like writhing worms. The arm disappeared, replaced by a face peering upside down through the windshield. It wasn't like the others. This one was larger, its features more pronounced, its grin wider and more jagged. Its eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, as its tongue, a long, blackened appendage, slithered out to drag across the glass. I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat as I swung the tire iron at the windshield. The face recoiled, hissing, before melting back into the mist. The truck rocked again, harder this time, as the creature circled the cab. Desperation overtook me. I lunged for the door handle, throwing it open and jumping out into the fog. The cold air hit me like a wall, and I stumbled forward, the tire iron still clenched in my hand. The mist swirled around me, alive with movement. Shadows darted in and out of view, their forms twisting and contorting in impossible ways. I turned toward the truck, hoping to use it as cover, but froze. The faces were back, pressed against the windows, their grins wider than ever. They watched me, their hollow eyes filled with a dark, mocking amusement. And then the tapping resumed. This time, it wasn't on the glass. It was coming from behind me. The tapping from behind sent a chill down my spine. Slowly, I turned, raising the tire iron like a makeshift shield. The mist was alive with movement, shadows shifting just beyond the edge of my vision. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. It felt ridiculous, like trying to scare off a thunderstorm with a scream, but the fog didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to thicken, coiling around me, dragging the air from my lungs. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, until I pressed against the side of the truck. And then, cutting through the oppressive silence, came the low growl of an engine. The sound was distant at first, barely audible over the thudding of my pulse. But it grew louder, unmistakable. A car was coming fast. I squinted into the fog, straining to see. 2 points of light pierced the mist, glowing like twin eyes. The roar of the engine intensified, rumbling low and steady, sending vibrations through the ground beneath my boots. A sleek, black car emerged from the haze, its headlights slicing through the gloom. It rolled to a stop a few yards away, the engine rumbling with a deep, guttural purr. The vehicle was unmistakable, a classic Chevrolet Impala. Its glossy black exterior gleamed, unmarred by the dirt and grime of the road. The sight of it was almost surreal, as if it didn't belong in this nightmare. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before the driver's door swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his boots crunching against the cracked pavement. He was wearing a leather jacket over a button-up shirt, and his face held an air of calm determination. The passenger door opened next, and a second man climbed out. He was slightly shorter, with longer hair and a plaid shirt beneath a rugged jacket. His expression was equally steady, though there was a sharpness to his gaze, as if he could see straight through the fog and me. The two men stood side by side, surveying the scene. "Well, this is a hell of a mess," the taller one said, his voice carrying a casual confidence that felt almost out of place. The other man nodded, his eyes scanning the mist. "Yeah, looks like we're just in time." I stared at them, dumbfounded. They didn't look afraid. If anything, they looked like they had done this 100 times before. "Who?" I began, my voice trembling. The taller man cut me off with a slight wave of his hand. "Don't worry, we're here to help. Name's Dean," he said, though the smirk on his face made it seem like even that name might not be real. The other man offered a tight smile. "So," I glanced at their car, drawn to the faint strains of music emanating from its open windows. Classic rock, Zeppelin I thought. The steady beat of the drums and wailing guitar riff were bizarrely out of place in the oppressive fog. "Who are you?" I asked, gripping the tire iron tighter. "Hunters," Dean said, as if that explained everything. Sam stepped closer, his gaze flicking to the truck. "Looks like you've attracted some attention." The Impala's headlights cut through the fog as the two men, Sam and Dean, prepared for what they called the showdown. I didn't know what that meant, but judging by the arsenal they unloaded from their trunk, it wasn't going to involve talking things out. Dean stood by the car, loading rock salt rounds into his shotgun, while Sam sketched symbols onto the ground with a piece of chalk. The lines were precise and deliberate, forming a circle that pulsed faintly with an eerie glow. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. Sam glanced at me briefly, his face calm but serious. "It's a containment trap. We need to keep the spirits in one place if we're going to stop them." Dean smirked, slamming the shotgun shut. "Stop them? Sammy, we're going to send these bastards packing." I wanted to believe their confidence, but the air around us was growing colder, and the mist thickened with every passing second. Shadows moved within the fog, their shapes twisting and writhing unnaturally. "They're here," Sam said, standing and pocketing the chalk. He gripped an iron blade, the edge shimmering faintly as if imbued with something more than metal. Dean stepped forward, leveling the shotgun at the mist. "All right, you ugly sons of B." Before he could finish, the fog exploded with movement. The spirits emerged, their grinning faces grotesque and jagged, their hollow eyes glinting with malice. They moved within human speed, darting and circling like predators. The first spirit lunged at Dean, its claws outstretched. He fired without hesitation, the blast of rock salt tearing through the creature. It shrieked and dissolved into a black, smoky haze, but two more took its place, grins widening as they charged. Sam stepped forward, the iron blade slicing through the air with precision. He struck one spirit across the chest, the contact sending sparks flying as the creature recoiled with a guttural hiss. "Jack, stay behind the circle," Sam shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I retreated to the edge of the chalk symbols. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the battle unfold. The spirits moved with an almost serpentine grace, their bodies stretching and contorting in ways that defied logic. One of them darted toward the trap, its claws raking across the ground as it tried to break the circle. "Not today," Dean growled, stepping in and firing another shot. The creature screeched as the rock salt tore through it, and it dissolved into mist. But the remaining spirits weren't deterred. They swarmed, their grins widening to impossible lengths as they circled the hunters. Sam shouted a string of Latin phrases, his voice steady and commanding. The air around him seemed to vibrate, and the glow from the chalk circle intensified. The spirits recoiled slightly, their forms flickering as if the words were burning them. "Keep it up, Sammy," Dean called, swinging his shotgun around to blast another spirit that had ventured too close. Sam continued the incantation, the words flowing with an authority that sent chills down my spine. The spirits' movements grew more erratic, their forms distorting further as they writhed in apparent agony. Then one of them broke free from the group, lunging straight at Sam. I shouted a warning, but Sam reacted instantly, ducking beneath its claws and driving his blade upward into its chest. The creature froze, its grin faltering as the blade pulsed with a faint, fiery glow. With a final, haunting shriek, it disintegrated into black smoke. Dean, meanwhile, was holding his own with brutal efficiency. When his shotgun clicked empty, he tossed it aside and grabbed a crowbar from the Impala's trunk. It wasn't an ordinary crowbar. The metal glowed faintly, as if imbued with some kind of energy. When Dean swung it at the nearest spirit, it connected with a thunderous crack, sending the creature flying. "Who's next?" Dean taunted, twirling the crowbar like a seasoned fighter. Another spirit charged him, claws slashing through the air. Dean ducked the attack, driving the crowbar into the creature's torso. The glow intensified, and the spirit howled as it disintegrated. Sam finished his incantation, raising his voice to a crescendo. The chalk circle flared with blinding light, forcing the spirits back toward its center. They're contained, Sam yelled, stepping beside Dean. Dean smirked. Good. Now, let's end this. Together. The brothers advanced on the remaining spirits, their movements synchronized like they'd done this 1,000 times. Sam's blade and Dean's crowbar worked in unison, cutting down the creatures one by one. The last spirit stood at the edge of the glowing circle, its grin faltering for the first time. It looked at me, its hollow eyes narrowing, and I felt a wave of icy dread wash over me. Jack, it whispered, its voice low and echoing. My name on its lips sent a chill through my soul. Before it could say more, Dean stepped forward and swung the crowbar with all his strength. The spirit shattered into a cloud of black smoke, its form dissipating into the night. Silence fell over the road. The glow from the chalk circle faded, leaving only the faint mist swirling in the headlights' beams. Dean wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, grinning. Well, that wasn't so bad. Sam shot him a look. You say that every time. Dean shrugged. And every time we walk away. So I'm not wrong. I stared at them, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. What were those things? I asked, my voice shaking. Spirits, Sam said simply. Malevolent ones. They feed on fear, trapping travelers like you to keep themselves alive. Dean leaned against the Impala, still gripping the glowing crowbar. They would have eaten you alive, Jack. You're lucky we showed up. Lucky. That wasn't the word I would have chosen. The aftermath of the battle left the road eerily silent. The mist, once thick and suffocating, had receded slightly, curling at the edges of the cracked asphalt like a retreating tide. My truck sat a few yards away, dented and smeared with soot, but intact. I stood near the Impala, clutching the tire iron like a lifeline. Sam and Dean moved with practiced efficiency, packing their arsenal back into the car's trunk as if this was just another day on the job. Dean caught me staring and smirked. Not bad for your first rodeo, huh? I blinked, my voice barely more than a croak. What just happened? Sam glanced up from securing a bag of salt. His expression was calm, but serious, like a professor preparing to lecture a student on a particularly grim topic. You've been driving on a cursed road, he said. A cursed road? I echoed, the words tasting ridiculous on my tongue. Dean leaned against the Impala, crossing his arms. Not just any cursed road. These are liminal spaces, places that aren't fully in one world or the next. They're like traps, waiting for someone unlucky enough to wander in. Some nodded. Most people don't make it out. These roads feed off fear, confusion, and despair. The more lost you feel, the stronger they get. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. The endless fog, the looping road, the creatures, it all made a horrible kind of sense. How did I survive? I asked. Dean gave a low chuckle, pulling a flask from his pocket and taking a swig. Luck mostly, and stubbornness. You kept moving, which made it harder for those things to break you. Sam stepped closer, his tone softer. Most people stop. They give in to the fear, and that's when the road takes them. You didn't. I wanted to feel proud of that, but all I felt was a hollow ache in my chest. I don't even know how I ended up here. I muttered, more to myself than to them. That old map in your glove box? Sam said, pointing toward my truck. It's not just a map. Roads like this are drawn to people who feel untethered. Dean arched an eyebrow. You've been running from something, haven't you? I froze, his words cutting deeper than I expected. Memories of long-haul drives, avoiding phone calls, and the emptiness of truck stops late at night flashed through my mind. You don't know me, I said defensively, though the bitterness in my voice betrayed the truth. Dean shrugged, unbothered. Don't have to. Seen it 100 times. People don't end up on roads like this by accident. Sam reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Take a look at that map again, he said. You might notice some markings you didn't see before. I hesitated but nodded, climbing into the cab of my truck. The map was where I'd left it, crumpled on the passenger seat. Unfolding it, I noticed faint, glowing lines branching out from the Bygone Route. Other roads, other traps, spiderwebbing across the country. What the hell? I whispered, running my finger along one of the lines. Sam's voice came from behind me. There are dozens of them. Some are worse than others. But if you know what to look for, you can avoid them. I turn, holding up the map. And this? What am I supposed to do with it? Dean smirked, leaning into the cab. Keep it. You never know when it might save your life again. The hunters helped me refuel using spare gas cans from the Impala's trunk. Dean handed me a silver flask filled with salt water, grinning as he said, "For the next time you run into something weird, just splash it around and hope for the best." Sam checked the truck, ensuring it was still drivable. "You've got enough gas to make it to the nearest town," he said, pointing toward the road. "Keep heading straight. The fog will clear soon." "And Jack," Dean added, his tone unusually serious. "Stick to the main roads. No more shortcuts." I nodded, gripping the map tightly. The Impala's engine roared to life, its headlights slicing through the remaining mist. The hunters climbed in, Dean behind the wheel, and Sam rolled down the window as they prepared to leave. "Take care, Jack," Sam said. "And remember, when things feel wrong, trust your gut. It's usually right." Dean gave me a parting grin. "And if you see us again, well, let's hope you don't." The car peeled away, the deep rumble of its engine fading into the distance. I stood there for a moment, staring after them, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the faint outline of a sign in the distance. Back in the cab, I started the truck and eased it onto the road. The air felt lighter now, less oppressive, and as I drove, the fog thinned until it was gone completely. The faint glow of a gas station appeared on the horizon, its neon sign flickering like a beacon. I pulled in, shutting off the engine and leaning back in my seat. For the first time in hours, maybe days, I exhaled, the tension draining from my body. I stared at the map in my lap, tracing the glowing lines with my finger. "What the hell have I gotten myself into?" I muttered. As I sat there, lost in thought, a familiar sound reached my ears. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable, the strains of classic rock drifting on the wind. I glanced toward the road, but there was no sign of the Impala. Still, the music lingered, a haunting reminder of the hunters and the surreal nightmare I had survived. Clutching the map, I started the truck again and pulled onto the highway. The road ahead was clear, stretching into the dawn, and for the first time in years, I felt a spark of hope. Whatever lay ahead, I would keep moving, always moving.